Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about imagining learning futures. My name is Punya Mishra, and I'm Associate Dean for Scholarship and Innovation at the Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. Thank you for joining us today for this conversation with author and journalist Leigh Alexander, whose story, The Void, we will be discussing today. Also with us is Dr. Andrea Thomer, information scientist and assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Information, who wrote the response essay, The Conundrum of Information Scarcity in a Time of Information Overload. Thank you both for joining me here. This conversation is part of Future Tense, a partnership between ASU, Slate, and New America that examines the impact of science and technology on society. I'm thrilled that we at the Teachers College have been able to collaborate with the Future Tense fiction team to put together a set of 3 stories on the theme of learning futures. Just FYI, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to share in a few days. To provide a bit of background, it is clear to all of us that education has been and will continue to be profoundly affected by changes in technology and science, as well as forces like climate change and globalization. Of course, there is tremendous uncertainty about how to navigate these changes. And as we look to the future, I believe it is critically important that we bring our imaginations into play. Fiction provides us with a unique space and opportunity to use imagination to explore the possibilities and challenges that lie ahead. So this set of 3 stories considers how learning experiences of different kinds may be shaped by new technologies and how individuals, institutions, and systems confront the moral and ethical challenges involved. Today, as I said before, we will be discussing a short story written by Leigh called The Void and Andrea's response to the story from her expert perspective. A bit of housekeeping before we dive into the conversation. We will save time for questions from all of you towards the end, so please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature in Zoom. If you submitted a question in advance and we have one, we will address them as well. You can use the chat feature in Zoom for all-purpose chatting, but please remember, we will only look at the questions in the Q&A section for our discussion. And now, I am excited to get started with a discussion. I know you are not here to listen to me, so without further ado, let's jump in. Leigh, Andrea, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background. Let's start with you, Leigh.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Punya. This has been an awesome experience, having this dialectical process of fiction and information science together. I feel so privileged to be invited. So a little bit about me. I have about 11 or 12 years experience in media of all kinds. I began as a video games journalist and I became a video games narrative designer. But I think my passion editorially has always been the self in digital space. I think, in fact, my interest in the narrative design of games is a proxy for, looking at the ways we build and orient lives in virtual society. How do we construct our image? How do we communicate with one another? How do the constructions of these platforms affect how we see ourselves? So that's been a focus of my work for pleasure for some time. And so, yeah, now I've started to kind of do through fiction what I used to do through editorial, which is to try to critique the traditional systems the traditional systems of value that are promoted by the technology industry, and try to shift in my little way the needle somewhat for those who are marginalized often by the traditional messages and ideas of these industries. Thank you so much for having me.
No, this is awesome. I mean, this is why I think this series is so much fun, is because it gives us, I'm an academic, it gives us an opportunity to open our view in some ways. And Andrea, if you can introduce yourself, because you come at it from a slightly different, more academic perspective, which I think this merging is what's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everybody. I'm Andrea Thomer. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Information at the University of Michigan. So I have a pretty interdisciplinary background. I won't go into all of it, but a lot of my research focuses on data curation and understanding scholarly data practices. So what is it that people do to make data fit for use, whatever it is that use they are intending is? And by scholarly practices, data practices, that's studying how scholars are working with data in order to create new knowledge, to come to conclusions about phenomena in the world. I do a lot of work with natural history museums because before coming to grad school, I worked as a paleontology excavator at the La Brea Tar Pits, and I got more interested in our data systems than I did the fossils necessarily. So another thread of my work is studying long-lived knowledge infrastructures. So thinking about how do we sustain these bodies, these data collections for really long periods of time. Museums and libraries and archives all can have the capacity. Some are already hundreds of years old. And the process of maintaining that knowledge over time is really interesting and becoming more complicated as it's all getting subsumed into databases, as opposed to staying on these actually relatively stable paper books and physical specimens and things like that. So that's a lot of my work. And in my teaching, I mostly work with the library archives and digital curation students in my department. And so that was a lot of the fun that I had in responding to Leigh's piece, because she was bringing up these like very classic issues of information access, but really touching on how they've changed dramatically now that that's facilitated by Google as opposed to libraries or something like that. So I won't get too ahead of myself there. So sorry.
No, there's a lot to unpack here, really, because, and I really love the way, Leigh, in the story, you take things which might be about information access, but bring it really into the characters and people and the context within which we live. And so for those who have not read the story, can you give us a quick summary without too many spoilers or revealing too much?
Yeah, I mean, like information access is a language issue, isn't it? And it's a narrative design issue. And I think the challenges that people might have today in accessing or encountering information mirror the challenges we have in designing, for example, narrative video games for people who don't have the vocabulary to interact with those. Like, these are overlapping challenges. So the story is about a gig worker who is kind of struggling to bridge this gap, like, due to a pandemic and due to, the state of information technology. This character is isolated in her apartment and underemployed, and finds that a terrifying void has started to open up whenever she tries to reach out using her device, which is, an abstraction for the medium we're all using now, the device. And the main narrative thrust of the story is that she becomes preoccupied by the memory of a painting or a dream of a painting that she's not sure whether it actually exists. And in trying to figure out whether she can verify her own memory, she encounters these challenges in data literacy, because how can you look for something that you don't know how to describe? You need to have the language and terminology of the platform that you're using to search. And so I think that's where Andrea's work and my work came together.
Cool, thank you. And I've always, I've done some of my research interests are in the space of creativity. And, I love reading about authors and how they wrote what they wrote, or, listening to interviews of directors of how did they make those choices in the final film that they made. And so I would just would love to hear from you. How the story came to be, the zigzag, often frustrating yet creative process that ends up in this final artifact. So can you tell us a little bit what inspired you? What research did you do in writing the story?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a passionate inhabitor of the internet. I am really in love with the surrealist shapes that have begun to emerge from a rapidly collapsing digital society powered entirely by half-sentient algorithms. Like, I absolutely love that use of language and that use of surrealism. So I'm always inspired by that when I write about the future. I've written stories about like algorithm doppelgangers or, sexist household AI. And in this particular case, the search for a painting was inspired by something that really happened to me. Dali's Ear Madonna is the most beautiful painting I've ever seen. And I couldn't remember whether, like, I had this same issue where I had a memory that I wasn't sure was real. And I went down the journey of this character myself. And I thought, like, this journey is inherently interesting. This experience of suddenly questioning my own reality because of the internet is interesting. And the Ear Madonna in particular, I think, was so inspiring to me for this piece, because it is a painting of tremendous scale in person. And as Dali describes, it really does look like something different depending on how close you're standing to it. And this is an experience of a painting or an experience of art that I cannot replicate using present technology. This sense of space and this sense of scale is lost. Like even like I had information access issues trying to re-encounter this painting, and then even when I could find it, I will never experience it again as intended. And that was something that I like deeply grieved. And then I was like, what else have I grieved? And what else are we losing? So the story is about a loss of a couple's plans to have a child, and a loss of traditional space, and a loss of scale and how we're perceiving culture in one another. So
Wow.
that was something I really wanted to cope with through writing that. I tried to put a
Wow.
lot in there. Thank you.
Yes, there is really a lot. I mean, if those who haven't read the story, please read it, because it is a very powerful and wonderful story. And when we had this previous conversation, I was reminded of when I was growing up in India, actually going and seeing Rodin's sculptures in real life. And that is such a completely different experience, seeing the thinker, or Adam and Eve, or whichever one you look at, because he used to always make them either smaller than life size or bigger than life size. And the experience of walking around, and not to make a facetious point, but to know that Rodin's thinker has a butt, is a really interesting,
It's identified by this silhouette, and people don't
exactly.
see it from the back. Yeah, exactly. Or you'll have this thing where, like, I've seen the Mona Lisa, it's so little.
Right.
And all around the Mona Lisa were standing people with phones.
Yeah.
So there is a medium now on top of medium, and that's where I'm trying to work as a writer, and I think that's really relevant to the work that Andrea is doing in terms of how to explore this rapidly agglomerating data mass with this arbitrary vocabulary.
So that's a perfect segue, Andrea, to you, to tell us a little bit about what were your first thoughts when you read the story, what intrigued you, and what were some of the themes that you explored in the piece that you did, the response piece that you wrote for Slate.
Yeah, there were a number of, I did identify, we talked about this a little bit, like in past, you've had people who found like 50 things and they only wrote about 2. And I didn't have quite 50, but there were things that didn't quite make it into the response just because of the direction that Slate wanted to go with it, which totally makes sense. But so I actually didn't initially see it as totally being about information literacy, but I was really interested in this process of trying to reconstruct chains of evidence. And so like in archives and in data science, you might refer to it as provenance, like trying to reconstruct your past steps to find this thing that was really intriguing, but then lost. And how there's so much research on preserving provenance and capturing provenance and translating it and sharing that provenance so that you can either reconstruct the context of an archive or reconstruct how a data set was created in the first place. And what struck me about this is that it hit on about like something that I've secretly suspected with some of these approaches is like, they're not gonna, like, they're all incomplete. That's what I should say, not that they're not gonna work, that they're only scratching the surface at the full experience of these, of preserving some sort of experience, which is exactly what you were talking about, Leigh, which is like, you're never gonna get back that experience of the ear Madonna for the first time. And so that's something that really struck me about it. And but the other piece was really this issue of like, how is it that we search these databases with like the databases that portray themselves as having complete knowledge, but they're actually partial, and us having to match our partial but different knowledge to their partial knowledge. And it's always us having to do the matching. These things that we have built to ostensibly serve us are things that we have to ourselves adapt to. And that's something that really struck me about it. So, and this is all tied up with issues of like, how are you creating data structures? How are you cataloging objects? How are you making interfaces for these databases and things like that? And also issues of access, like open access. What are the paywalls and the other obstacles that you're throwing in front of people as they're trying to find this knowledge? Sometimes due to copyright restrictions, other times due to extremely, honestly, quite profitable business models for a lot of publishers and things like that. So I really liked that the piece got at all of those things. And yeah, but the part that I didn't get to write about in my response was also the impact, and I'm sure Leigh's gonna have a ton to say about this, but I liked that there were women in this space and talking about particularly like how women are navigating these technological spaces in a way like that doesn't get written about in all science fiction and in all science and technology studies and things like that.
Thank you.
So go ahead, Leigh.
Yeah, I think I've been like kind of indelibly imprinted by, particularly the experience of being a woman in the technology industry. And I've, through my experiences on the front lines of certain cultural discussions in my industry and the ways that I was, targeted as a result, I think I got to see up close, for so many women and other white people of color, people otherwise marginalized by their identity, this utopian dream of the cyber sci-fi hippie utopia that we were raised was supposed to be for everyone. But there's something really funny about digital space, which is that if you decline to impose any kind of curation on the culture that exists there, it's just going to replicate the same garbage that exists in the real world. There's a book that I cite all the time by Nick Yee called The Proteus Paradox, which points out that, in Second Life, a world where you can do and be anything, houses still have beds and chairs, like when you can fly, and it's because when we don't reimagine structure, our utopia just becomes a replication of the existing structure. And so, for me, I don't think that there are relevant stories. I don't think that the same old stories about the future are relevant anymore at all. I think that, we need to look closer to the margins, and we have like a married lesbians and one's a university professor and they have housing. That's not particularly even marginalized, but for science fiction, it's or for futurism, it's not usually heard because we don't think of when we think of survival, we think of the inspiring part, and we don't think of how hard, we don't think of who's marginalized by progress. And that's the only kind of stories that I'm interested in telling. And that's not to say that I want to do dystopian fiction, but I am interested in the complicated consequences of progress on people living at the margins of society. Yeah, thank you for noticing that, Andrea.
Yeah, thank you, Leigh. What was really interesting to me about the story at some level was it seemed like, there is this pandemic and there is some kind of a data breach. So it seemed very much like the world we live in, but just turned up to 11 in some directions, maybe.
I think that's what I have to do to get people to care about, like I actually don't think there was anything particularly futuristic about it. But if I just trying to use the Black Mirror language, we can see that there are people struggling now in worse ways and in more horrific ways than we have yet depicted through futurism. So I don't even mind if it's presentism, I think we need to start thinking about this. Sorry, sorry to interrupt. I get enthusiastic.
No, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. I mean, I just loved some of the phrases that you used, like the whole tenderloin Ebola. I mean, that was just such an evocative disease, I mean, and you're talking about surrealism and mundane, who would have thought coronavirus?
Sorry to interrupt. The Tenderloin is a district of San Francisco where they have resurgences of medieval diseases. So it's yet San Francisco is the most clueless place in the world. So I will always name diseases after San Francisco. Sorry, once again, I got excited.
That's perfect. That's perfect. So there were a couple of themes that I wanted us to explore before we jumped in, to other things. So one is this whole idea that, Leigh, that you mentioned, that mediation of mediation, right? That we live in this world where things are curated for us and they are supposedly designed for us. So, I mean, you have some amazing sort of music examples that people are listening to and so on. So maybe there are some really nice details there about this difference between sort of the physical interactions that happen and the sort of the mediated ones that happen. And so maybe, Andrea, I'm going to go to you first and have you sort of talk about this theme and how your thoughts about that, and then I'll switch back to Leigh after that.
About the mediation of mediation, things like that.
Either the mediation of mediation or the fact that we live in this world where, like in the story, for instance, this reality creeps in terms of a broken sink or, a kitchen something, but otherwise most of the things are always through little mirrors or little glass devices or, interactions that way.
Yeah, let me think. I really liked that tension between the physicality, the really essential physicality of providing them with warmth and shelter and sustenance was crumbling, while there was also this beautifully constructed ambient sort of cover up for it. and so like I question the mediation, because in that case, it doesn't feel like, I guess it's a mediation of your physical space, but it also feels like it's a papering over in some ways. It's trying to sate your senses in light of crumbling reality in some ways. So I like how complicated that was, and I think it's honestly extremely relevant for a lot of us, like who, especially these days, as we're all communicating through Zoom, and like we have this like incredibly sophisticated technology that we're all using, and we can't go to the grocery store like without it being like this weird risk assessment. We can't go hang out with our friends without it like having to do this whole discussion of who's seeing who, and you know, basically doing your own contact tracing. I feel like there's probably also, I haven't thought this through, and maybe I'll jump in later, but I think there's also mediation happening in the information space as well, which is like, and I'm trying to think of an eloquent way to say it, but it's, yeah, looking at representations of a painting, representations of the representation of the painting. And again, those chains of representation going from the original painting to the painting on your device, to the painting on the wall, and all of the information that is lost and then glommed onto it in that process. So losing context, but getting, I don't know, lots of tag-alongs in the form of, you know, access restrictions and paywalls.
To an identical apartment and having the same relationship problems.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so.
Leigh, I would give a slightly different twist for you on the same question, because there is a lot of, you know, for instance, there's a mention in the story of the character wanting to go do healthcare, like physically hands-on, but ends up getting waitlisted and doesn't end up doing, and ends up doing some sort of this quasi-sex work, which turns into working with a grown man who wants to be there's the surreal caregiver. I mean, there's so much of that intention to connect, which doesn't play out or pan out. So can you talk about how you thought about that in your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the labor economy is kind of unraveling beneath people's feet as they go. And I think it's just kind of, I think the economy for your plans changes quicker than you can reach the workforce to execute those plans. That's something so many people that I know, and so many young people in particular, are facing now, like, you know, a bottom that is falling out faster than they can run. And, you know, I think I really feel for this character who very much wanted to take care of people, and that what the labor and the junction of care and labor is so, you know, exploited in extreme late capitalism, and it becomes this really muddled thing where she wants to take care of people, and then that physical interface is taken away from her, and then it's like, well, I do kind of want to do sex work, and now it's not even really sex work, you know, it's like abstracting until it's requiring that she market her fundamental nurturing instinct itself, even at the expense of like her own plans for the future. So I think that loss of space and that trying to hang on to the essence of what it is you do in a rapidly changing labor economy was something that, you know, I really wanted. You know, I think a lot of my characters are going through this. It's something that I relate to a lot too. Just living in an immaterial labor economy that is particularly exploitive of women.
So, Andrea, you actually brought up a similar theme in your piece, where you talked about how these data structures, the way they have been created, actually marginalize certain groups and people. I think that was a theme that connected across both these stories. Can you sort of, maybe you can speak to that a little bit? So I want to get back to the whole gig economy and higher ed piece at some point, because that is a reality again. I think that a lot of our graduates and people are facing. But let's talk about a little bit about the way this information is structured actually systematically marginalizes certain groups, right? Because of the lack of the language or the vocabulary or access to how these databases are structured.
So there's two ways I see this as happening. And I also want to make sure so this is something that I've entirely learned through my teaching, which is like, given that this is a series on education and learning, I want to point that out, just because like my research focuses on like scientific data, but I'm teaching this class for the last 4 years on this broad introduction to information organization, which is a pretty traditionally like library and information science class to be taking, like a lot of metadata and cataloging. But I've loved teaching this class so much because it introduced me to this whole new world of like considerations in making information available that I had not been as privy to. So, and both of these are kind of like these themes are coming out of that area. So the first one is, and this is something that like librarians have been aware of, and some awesome librarians, I quoted, linked to information about radical librarian Sandy Berman. But he's been criticizing systems like the Library of Congress subject headings for decades. He started doing this in the 70s, pointing out that the first way that like these systems can marginalize people is by the language in which they're used to name groups of people. And so Sandy Berman's book, Prejudices and Antipathies, is this beautiful like 10-chapter like examination of the Library of Congress keywords basically that they use to index books, and systematically going through and showing ways in which they are biased towards white, Christian, male, cisgender Americans, and how they are marginalizing basically everyone that doesn't fit into that. And so basically forcing like, and there's been a lot of pushes in that space over the years to try to give people more control over the ways in which they are described in these settings. But it's still, we've got a lot of work to do. Like there's still fights about this. A recent debate was around, many people were pushing to remove the term illegal aliens from the Library of Congress because that's highly offensive, and pushing to have it replaced with undocumented immigrants. And Congress actually, certain members of Congress from a certain political party voted to not do that, because they argued that it needed to mirror the language that Congress was using and that was used in legislation.
It requires historical accuracy.
Yeah.
AKA how they wanted it to be.
yeah, exactly. So so this is still a fight that needs to be had. So that's in like a very traditional like cataloging schema for like making information accessible broadly, like through libraries and stuff like that. But the other way, and I think this is getting to the kind of algorithmic stuff, is thinking about how algorithms are trained. And this is stuff that work, like Sophia Noble is probably the most well-known person doing work in this space. She wrote a book recently called Algorithms of Oppression, talking about the ways in which Google trains its search results on what people click on. And if those people are biased, then it's going to show biased search results.
Yeah, I've done some journalism on this too, like on like if you if you type, I did an article for The Guardian, and if you typed in unprofessional hair, it would show you only Black women. You know, and it's because the algorithm is taught to repeat what it learns and crystallize what it learns through behavior. So once again, it's that example of if we don't have a correction in place for bias or some kind of curation, it's just going to replicate what the users are already doing that's harmful.
Exactly. Yeah. So I thought both of those issues were coming into play in Leigh's story in a really interesting way. So
cool. So there were a couple of questions from the audience which I think were very relevant, and I'm going to sort of tweak it slightly. One of the powerful things about fiction, which is why we wanted to do this series, is because it brings in this aspect of human emotion, brings in sort of the lived experience where you can be a character, empathize with the character. And Leigh, I think there was another one of your stories that I mentioned that I read, blanking on the name right now, which, I mean, that, like I told you, just wormed its way into my head. And, you know, I've been talking nonstop about it, but I just love that story. And I think The Void is also a very emotionally fraught story. And audience member Amber Kelly asked this question, which is the void real? If so, what are the origins of the void? If not real, what anxiety or fear specifically does it representing with the character? And I want to add one layer to that, which I say it's not just the character, it's the context within which the character exists, because the behavior of the character is not just, you know, it's not ab initio, it is dependent on the stimuluses and responses and context within which they work. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what your sort of conception of the void was, because there are many layers to that idea, I think, in the story.
I mean, on the simplest version is there's certain people under a certain age, like what happens when your phone rings? Like someone, like, how do you feel? Like you will have an actual neurological response, like why? Like, oh my God, like, and that terror of an unexpected contact through a channel that like we're so used to, you know, having now control over ourselves in space via this device. We can consider everything we say before we say it. We're curating ourselves in virtual space. So this any sort of unexpected change in that paradigm feels like a void. It's the absence of training data for the algorithm. So like in the simplest form, it's being afraid of getting a phone call. But I think the thing that I was thinking about the most is that what does your life become when the use of the medium is fricative for you? Like I had a thought the other day that I don't have a landline right now. And what if my husband was choking or something and I couldn't find my phone? I think in some ways, what we call advancements is, I think about people who now have to wait in telephone queues to get therapy, that's who I'm thinking of, because it's already so hard, and if you're someone who feels dread at every notification, or I know what it's like to be unable to even consider your screen sometimes because you're overwhelmed, and yet you must confront this thing in order to make the next step in changing your quality of life. And so I think that especially in a situation where we're all isolated due to a pandemic and our traditional ways of sharing space with each other are eliminated, I think something that I find very dread-inducing is that friction that isolates us from one another and how it can grow. And I think that it takes different shapes for different people, but it started with the fear of being called unexpectedly. And now there's a fleck in my eye all the time now. Basically, that's how I felt. I wanted to put it into words. Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a question from Dana Hendrickson, because I think that's one of the powerful themes in the story is around this issue of mental health and digital spaces. So I'm just going to put it out there as an idea and have the two of you sort of speak to that, because I think that is a powerful sort of a theme that plays out in that story. And I think you sort of talked about that in that sense of dread. And I think, Andrea, you had this phrase, I'm trying to find it, I have it in my notes, the existential dread of information overload, and so Andrea, maybe you could speak to that, and then Leigh, get your thoughts on as you were writing the story.
Yeah, I also connected the void to the idea of just the frustration and all the bad feelings that come with having to navigate a hostile information space. And so I thought about trying to refind articles, making travel plans for some reason, which is a weird, I don't know why that's the thing that I go to, but it's alarmingly stressful, too many things to try to look through and sort through and compare and try to navigate. So the headline that Slate gave the article was about the problems of information scarcity amidst information overload, which I think is pretty accurate. So good job to the editor there, because we're now we're in a pretty hostile information space most of the time. This is the other difference between more traditional library and museum sorts of systems versus places where we're relying on and not to say that those were perfect, there were and are all sorts of issues with those spaces, but we are now in a place where our eyes are monetized, our attention is part of everybody's business model. So the point of a lot of information spaces, particularly things like social media, and even search like Google, isn't necessarily to get you what you need or you're looking for, it's to keep you there. And to keep you engaged, keep you clicking, keep you buying whatever it is that Instagram decided to show you that week. And that for me is also I think that's part of the information overload and a little bit of the void as well, which is feeling lost in this sea of hostile advertisement and things like that. So,
well, we had an ongoing example of exactly that happening on the chat right now. So I mean, it's not that we aren't living through that phenomena at this very moment. So one thing, and I'll come to you, but I was reminded of something I read yesterday. It seems like most jobs now are based in remote Oregon, because jobs posting places didn't have an option for a geographical location. So people would put in remote, and it would automatically put them in this place called remote Oregon. So the greatest job growth happening in the United States right now is in remote Oregon, which I thought was very cute. Again, coming back to this point of how we label data, how we what options are available and what are not, and what gets then sucked into the database from, whatever is out there, however strange and weird it might be. I want to actually, one of the things that was like most fun in the story, which to me was these sort of surreal elements, Leigh, that you bring into the story. And I have always, and we talked about this earlier, like I am always amazed by how weird our everyday world is, that we live on this rock and this, big giant ball of fire pops up every day and then sets the other day. Everything just seems totally strange to me. And then we live in these worlds where it's things like this, where we are sitting here and chatting through these little boxes, and I'm trying to monitor what nonsense somebody has typed into a chat, and and that seems mundane. And I think what you do a really wonderful job in the story is create this world with little details. And maybe you can speak a little bit to that world creation and what thoughts went into that, because you have this, I don't remember the exact specifics of the kind of music that you're listening to, or there's this moment where they put on this virtual fireplace and it actually makes them feel warm. And I think that's just such an evocative, and I don't think it explicitly said, like, maybe we felt a little, there is this sort of ambiguity and ambivalence there that I would love to have you talk a little bit about, because I think you've just really created a very, I can see that word, So how did you think about it?
I discovered that trick in quarantine, honestly. Like if you put a crackling fire on your screen and you put the light the right color, your body can maybe be tricked, maybe. But, it made me think of, housing, space, location, in this time when we are, the coronavirus pandemic has sort of accelerated a vision of this world where we are more mediated than we were before, and where we're living in virtual space more. And I think, I hope that the world recovers soon. There's been a ridiculous loss of life that I don't wish to trivialize and call it like a learning experience. So I want to be totally clear on that. But like to some extent, we will not return to this pre-virtual world. And I think these questions of how do we find a sense of space? How do we find a sense of connection? How do we find a sense of value in each other when we won't be sharing the same physical space so much? I think those are, the front of my mind. And, it's interesting. So everybody knows that generations and their preferences are cyclical in a certain sense. So all teens are nostalgic for things that they haven't experienced. But that's been particularly interesting for, the last couple generations of young people to grow up for, like, nostalgic for Windows 95 sound and nostalgic. Like a lot of music today is using Sega Dreamcast sounding samples. Like, those kids were not born yet, but it was like maybe they were little and their, older uncle or cousin had it. It's a memory of something that they didn't quite live through, but are curious about anyway. And when we look at this as virtual space, like young content creators today are so clever, it blows my mind. There's a really cool article. I want to say it's a Gia Tolentino article in New Yorker, but it is about Toto's Africa playing from an empty mall, which is a YouTube video. It's exactly what you described. It's a picture of an empty mall and the tinny sound of Toto's Africa playing from the overhead speakers. And the article explored the way that young people today are nostalgic for this like sort of commercial sense of liminal space that they never actually experienced. And that sort of made me think of like, what are the tactile, what types of audio is gritty enough to create a sense of space? And for me, it's like being trapped in the car for hours at a red light, listening to One Sweet Day as the One Sweet Day is like one of the songs that was at #1 the longest in my childhood. So the throwbacks were pretty particularly chosen because I thought they'd speak to people in my age range, but also like, what will future generations be nostalgic for, and how will they create a sense of space and community? The notion of like one of the videos they listen to is family dining room. Like, who's going to have a dining room? Like,
right.
that's something that's never going to happen in a generation. Nor is a dining room for their family. Where I'm drinking powdered meals right now because human beings are not meant to live in isolation and feed themselves 3 meals a day. Like what we know as, you know, the fond and intimate bits of society are changing. And I'm not one of those people that like technology is a tool like anything else, and we will find other things that are intimate and valuable, and we will continue to, like, it's like, oh no, human connection will be lost because of technology, but this particular modality will be lost, and we will process that and grieve that as a society in ways that I think are
and what I think is like really interesting is that the examples that you give in the story are all, they remind me of sort of Netflix algorithms, right? Even those are, you know, those are sort of nostalgia about nostalgia. It's that assuming that you will be nostalgic, you know, somebody's deciding what you are going to be nostalgic about, which I thought was super fascinating. There's a question from oh yes, sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
Well, I just wanted to chime in there because like I actually I don't know, like I felt the Panera, the Outcast playing over Panera speakers and those other examples, those ones hit me. And I think like, and it's not, for me, it's not like young person nostalgia. It's nostalgia for what my normal life was like last year. You know, like I was joking with some friends about like, well, not joking, but like, you know, we're at a year into the pandemic and we're all reflective and we all miss even the annoying parts of our lives. Like, like one of my friends was joking that like she missed Panera. She's not ashamed to admit it. And like, I buy that.
It's funny the things that you miss. Like it's one thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately is that, you know, actually the history and the emotion and the sentiment of a culture or a family or whatever is told through its junk. Not through its high art, but through its garbage. Like when I want to go and remember my ancestors.
Such a good point. Yeah.
I have boxes full of their crap, you know, things my sister gave me when we were children. And when I die, that's the box that means the most to me. And I think on a larger cultural scale, we can be super fond of our junk.
That's such a wonderful insight. And I want to just connect it back, Andrea, to the work that you do, you know, which is working with museums and curating and sense making and meaning making of things which might just be, you know, detritus, but have actually been meaningful, right? I think that's just such a powerful idea. I'm just, you know, it's just sparking thoughts in my head. I just want to go to a question that came in from Data Friend. And Leigh, this is for you, which is the way the main character in the story is able to pursue her interest in the painting, but the issue with the sink and the eventual collapse of the floor is depicted as an unsolvable environmental problem. Was that dichotomy intentional?
I mean, yeah, I think the short answer is I think a lot of people feel structurally powerless. And our little weird internet hobbies and serial murder mysteries and conspiracy theories are how we keep ourselves together when our floors are falling in. Yeah,
no, that was a good point there. One of the things that I did want to touch on is there is a description, and Andrea and I, you know, live in this world of higher ed, and it was really interesting to find somebody writing stories about us. But it is a very sort of a dystopian kind of an us in many ways, which is this, and you know, we know of people who, you know, have their PhDs and are living in crumbling apartments and doing this sort of gig teaching jobs. So maybe Andrea, you can speak a little bit to that, you know, like to that nature of that reality, and then maybe Leigh, I can come back to you with your thoughts on how you came to it.
Yeah, that's a super hard and depressing one. I'm really lucky that I have this stable job at a great university. Like I feel so lucky because that's not been true for everybody that I know out of grad school. I mean, my main comment on it is like it is the result of a lack of investment in higher education and in education in general. Like this is just what's been going on for decades. We have been slowly removing any federal or state funding from the allegedly state schools. And we've had to rely more and more on donors, on endowments, on football, on all this other stuff. And this is what happens. You wind up having this horrible like gig class essentially in the form of adjuncts and sometimes even lecturers that aren't paid fairly. And it's awful. Like I have no good solution other than unionize. Like, and for those of us that are privileged like me to like, I hope I don't get in trouble by, it's good that this is recorded. It's fine. But like I really do think that for people that are on the tenure track that have these more stable positions need to also stick up for our adjunctified colleagues and really lobby for more long-term contracts, actually fair pay, and to have an actually equitable workplace, because the ways in which it's not sustainable. And I know that and it's actively under threat by if you've read anything about what's going on with I think it's the University of Wisconsin, and just paring down departments, trying to reverse tenure, things like that. It's bad. That's my comment.
So I think coming to you, Leigh, I'll just add a little piece to that, but I think there is poverty being played out in the story at multiple levels. So one is sort of the poverty of experience itself, the lack of connection between people. And then there is the precarity of existence, the poverty, which sort of reveals itself in the cracks, right? In some sense. So maybe you can speak to how you sort of brought those themes together, but I think they work together really powerfully.
Well, so their university housing situation and Rose's career, where she's feeling, emotionally kind of extended and having fewer boundaries in terms of her time. I'm not in academia, but I have many, many, many friends and colleagues who are. And, this is sort of inspired by experiences that I know people are having who are incredibly educated and who are teaching at a high level, but who are somehow struggling to survive. And it's important to note that Rose is the one that's supporting Hetty. Rose is able to do this, it's implied, because she has a safety net through a family member. But if Hetty didn't have this relationship, her work is not sustained. Her work has been completely crystallized to the digital dust. And so I think, isn't that going, even if we have well-paid academic jobs, does that allow someone to start a family and support a partner? I mean, the thesis of this story is that it doesn't, you know what I mean? And yeah, I don't know. I do think that both of them, Hetty made this comment oh, well, we'll both take care of babies. But I think it is a lot about this loss of boundary between labor and care and what's expected from women disproportionately. I do think a lot of my friends who are teaching, they seem to be really, really stressed, and it really, I sound very ignorant and uneducated, but I can't understand why they're doing it. It looks so intense. And, if I in my media career feel, that some of my options or the future are limited, it's a thing that I probably have in common with people who are teaching.
Yeah, I think there's a real question there of who gets to pursue. I mean, I don't know. It feels on the one hand so privileged to complain about who gets to be a professor or whatever. It's a remarkable position to be in. And but I think there's the broader issue that it's pointing to is who gets to pursue intellectual goals, who gets to pursue that highest level of Maslow's.
Yeah, we call it higher learning.
Yeah. Who gets to do that? And
who determines what it's called? I like that Rose is Hetty is oh, you're not a sex worker, you're doing experience design and care and collaboration.
Yes.
It's an academic way of looking at the role of the labor in society that made them like it more. It's kind of like drugs. What you're calling it depends on who's politically in charge.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I have to apologize. I got a comment back that I asked the question to Andrea that I never did follow up about the whole digital and mental health piece, which is such a powerful theme with you, Leigh. So Leigh, if you could speak to that. I'm so sorry. And I'm glad that the listeners are correcting me, which is good.
For Andrea to respond or for me?
No, for you, Leigh.
Yeah.
I never got
about
to you
mental health?
Yeah, that theme that plays out in there.
Yeah, I mean, I really have not been able. So in the work that I'm doing about women in digital society, I find that all of them are in some kind of therapy, recovery, codependency. They are working with an AI. This theme keeps coming up again and again in everything I write, because I do think that an ungoverned digital society has been absolutely traumatic to this generation of women. That's something that's one thing. And then I also think that I think we're losing mental health services and access to mental health services before our eyes. And I think the additional layers of friction of now having to deal with online forms and virtual queues and notifications and the crawling void. I've really worried a lot about people during this pandemic, thinking about how hard it is to make a call when you need help, and how hard it's going to be to use a phone bank when you need help. These are things that sort of scare me, that we don't have, that access to these services is not easy. or is not complete. And it's a reflection of this like band-aid oriented digital society we have, where if you like and share, it's going to automatically have, it's a superficial engagement oriented approach to solving these problems that I think is depriving people of resources. I think that's true in mental health. I think that's true in education. I think that's true in support for people socially. There's a lot of, there's a lot of consequences of this utopian late capitalist technology environment.
And I think it comes together, it comes through in the story most powerfully in that sort of resentment that builds between the characters about like you're spending so much time supporting your students and the sense that that same support is not available. I think that's just a really poignant sort of moment in the story. I am cognizant of time, and so I need to have a couple of things that this sort of series is built around. So one of the things that at the college we have been working on is this idea of principled innovation, that as we think about these technological changes or any innovation that we do, that we need to be thinking through about sort of the moral and ethical consequences of these challenges. So based on the story, Andrea, I'll start with you. What kind of moral and ethical challenges do you see reflected in the story? Because one of the things we would love to do is take the stories, these videos, and actually use them in a classroom context as a basis for further discussion, right? So what would be some themes or ideas that you see reflected in the story that would be worthwhile for us to think deeper about? And then Leigh, I'll come to you after that.
Yeah, I think a big one is who's being left out from your system, from your software, from your database, from your library, from your school. Who's it being designed for, and who's being marginalized by that design? So I think you can see in my reflection, in my response piece, I talked a lot about like the academic language that governs access to databases. And some of that is just like, some of that is a functionality of how databases work. You need a word associated with things in order to find the thing. But I think those words are tailored to a particular community. This isn't a new insight. We've known this for a long time. So paying attention to whose words are being privileged and whose are not being paid attention to. And I think that goes, I'll let Leigh talk about this because I know she's got lots of insights on this, but I think with the experience design, I think there's also a really interesting case to be made about what experience are you paying attention to and trying to fix? What version of reality are you investing in? Or what problems are you investing in fixing? I think that's how I want to say it. Yeah.
And I think those would be the things that I chose too, like who's not being heard, and where are the structural flaws. Yeah, I think that's a lot about what I wanted to get at. But yeah, I do think that the thing about space as crucial to our understanding of society and experience, and what we will grieve the loss of with as digital space, as we're living more of our lives in digital space. I think it's interesting to think about what we're going to grieve and how we're going to replace it, and what that process is going to look like. The funny, algorithmic, surreal, weird human dreaming that is going to sort of fill this period of time that's to come.
Thank you. I think this idea of grieving plays out at so many levels in the story, grieving about this relationship, grieving about the baby, grieving about the painting that she cannot find, and just the overall ambience. And I think that's a really great way of putting it. We do have a question from the audience, and Leigh, this maybe both of you can address actually. This is Habib from Kashmir, who is sending this question from India. So he's wondering about the future of fiction when AI will develop fiction based on the basis of big data instead of humans. So algorithms that will write stories, and we have already started seeing some of that. And then the second question, I think, follow up to that, which I think is very direct to what we were just talking about. What will be the fate of marginalized communities which have least representation in big data when these stories do get written? I think that's a great question.
I want to answer the AI stories one, because I'm really keen on procedural language. So even an AI that writes a story has to be authored by someone. It has to be given a data set. If you just let it choose from all the things in the world, it'll never do anything interesting. But AI is a form of authorship. These are tools made by people. And it is a way of writing that is a conversation between a person and an AI, but there will never be any absence of human authorship. Even if the AI writes its own stories perfectly for 500 years without intervention, someone will have given it the training data and the grounding to make it work that way.
Yeah, so this is a piece that I'd written a few years back about creativity, is that it becomes more of a partnership with the tool than it is the tool itself. I mean, it can give you a lot of options, but there's this joke about Man Ray, the surrealist painter, that his dropped pieces were always aesthetically more beautiful than if I would go and just drop some pieces of paper and frame it. And that was the artist's eye, which would come in and say, I need to keep this one and throw away 99 others. So I think that dialogue between the two. But Andrea, maybe you can talk a little bit about the second part that he talked about, that if we are basing it on this big data, which we know are biased, and we've already talked about that, what does that mean in terms of the stories that we tell?
In terms of the stories that we tell, or in terms of
the stories that we create. Sorry, yes.
I mean, we're going to have biased stories if we base them on biased data. This is something we definitely know. And as Leigh said, there's nothing that's just magically coming out of a computer. It's all based on a human-created data set. And I think that means that there's a lot of pushes to de-bias the data sets, or maybe another way to put it is to actually surface the bias in the data sets and surface the positionality of the people making the data sets in the first place. And I think if we want to mitigate those harms that can come from just surfacing and focusing on one community, one kind of person's story, we need to take that sort of work really seriously. And I have been encouraged that I know, like in some of the machine learning communities of the researchers doing this, there is more and more work towards fairness, algorithmic transparency, trying to think about catching those biases earlier rather than later. Kate Crawford has done a ton of really cool work on trying to just doing art pieces around the bias that come out of these image training data sets that are going into all sorts of facial recognition sorts of software. So I think we'll just keep reifying our existing structural inequities until we start addressing them head on. And I do think that one place to start with that is by looking at the data sets themselves and again, thinking about who's harmed, who's being left out, who's being privileged and prioritized over others, whose will is being imposed on others.
Right. I think
we've been working all along with biased data sets. It's called Western civilization.
and I have to, I'm looking at the time, we're at 3 minutes. I may need to sum up a little bit, but I have to say, Leigh, the story that I forgot and Henry messaged me is The Future We Wanted is a story that, and I think that just speaking to the point that Andrea is making, that we need to widen that data set. I think the data set also includes the works of fiction that we create. And I think that's why that story so resonated with me, because it really put me, even this story and the Future We Wanted, both of them put me in a position of understanding a point of view, which, given who I am and my background and gender and all of that, is sometimes not accessible to me. And I think that's what fiction does in a really powerful way. I'm going to just have each of you do a quick, if there's anything that we missed talking about that you think, we covered a lot of ground in a discursive sort of way, which is, I think, the best kind of conversation, really. Anything that you want to add before I do the summing up at the end?
Good. Yeah. This has been super fun. One thing I would love to hear from Leigh more at some point, or I don't know, I'm very interested in your career path as journalist to video game designer to storyteller, which is super cool. But thanks in general for inviting us to this. And it's been really fun to have this conversation.
Yeah, please do. Email me, Andrea. I'd be happy to talk about that. I love making stories with patterns. A lot of my fiction and my interactive work revolves around these themes. It's my current goal now to do a book of short stories like this, with themes in common. So if anyone's listening who has good ideas on how to make that happen in a nice way for me, I'd love to hear from you. This has been a super cool opportunity for me as a writer. It's been an honor to have educated people engage with my work and feed and, mirror the themes to me so articulately. I'm tremendously grateful for your time and energy and for the invitation to be part of this. It's really it's one of the coolest opportunities I've ever had as a writer. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very kind. This is in my life, this is among my high points of every month that I get to do this. And I just 3 times, I'm hoping we can find ways of continuing this because it really opens us up to possibilities and opportunities that are awesome. So I want to just thank both of you for joining us today and the pieces you wrote. Thanks to all the people who joined in, watching with the questions and comments. I also want to be sure to thank all the people who made this series and events possible. First, the Future Tense team, including the folks at Slate, New America, and ASU Center for Science and the Imagination for working with us on this collaboration. The Principal Innovation team, the Marketing and Events team, and my colleagues in the Office of Scholarship and Innovation at the Teachers College. I would encourage you to check out the first story by Simon Brown, and the response by my colleague Iveta Selova, and the conversation that followed. And of course, the third story of the series by Shiv Ramdas will go live on Slate on March 27th with a response by my friend Katrina Michaels, and that's a conversation I'm really looking forward to. So I'll be back beginning of April to host that discussion. And without spoilers, let me say it's another awesome story in a different style altogether, which is great. And finally, to round off this Learning Futures series, Slate will be hosting a special event featuring all 3 of our short story authors, Simon Brown, Leigh Alexander, and Shiv Ramdas. And I have the privilege of moderating that as well. So super excited and actually honestly nervous about that. You can learn more about Learning Futures at the Teachers College by going to learningfutures.education.asu.edu. Thank you all very much. And thank you, Andrea, Leigh. This was absolutely a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been amazing for me. Thank you so much, everyone.